Well, welcome back. I'm not sure if this is days or minutes after you saw part one, but either way, I want to let you know that I'm going to back up a little bit and cover a few things at the end. I believe a little bit of overlap helps to connect separate presentations of the same content, the same module. So we'll start here on the equity issues that we left off. Boy, this is a hot issue. Misunderstandings on this are huge. That's why we really need to focus some of our discussion time on this. I've suggested that the best way to go is a high minimum subsidy plus publicly and privately funded scholarships on a means-tested basis so that low-income family children can then get into the fancier schools, the ones that have pedagogies and or themes that cost more than the amount that the taxpayer is willing to provide for everybody. Before I get into some of the specifics again, including some that I already went over at the end of the last one, let me remind you that in all cases, it's very important to differentiate between facts and opinions. Okay, for example, in this module, how schooling is different from ordinary private goods that are delivered routinely in market settings, those are facts. Okay? Now, what should be done about them? Those are definitely opinions, and I'm going to throw mine out here so we can have a robust discussion of them. And I want you for the next essay that you're going to write, instead of picking from a list, I want you to write up briefly what your vision would be in terms of either the end result of governance and funding policies for a school system or how you would change the existing one. Remember, be a gardener, not an engineer. Okay, so in other words, you're not going to centrally plan how people teach things and which books ought to be used. You're going to address the funding and governance rules that affect how public and private schools make those kinds of choices for classrooms. All right, so back to the equity issues in the slide that you see above, see there for you. Let me switch to the slideshow mode here. I should have done that already from the current slide. There we go. All right, so there again we have my vision of how I think it would work best given the various trade-offs. Not perfect. You know, there's something to be said for having a larger subsidy or a smaller subsidy, or even like Milton Friedman said, there should be no subsidy. That, yes, and he was, we're talking about a smart man that's anything but cruel. All the money that he had left over, which was a lot, after he passed away, well, in fact, long before he passed away, was put into the Milton Friedman Foundation for School Choice. But his bottom line was that if we could just get the government out of it totally, we would be better off. So anyway, there's a diversity of opinion here, and we all want to weigh in with that and not get our feelings hurt if there's disagreement. Here's my ability, my version of coping with the pros and cons of different ways to do it. So subsidy, a high minimum subsidy, but non-discrimination, which means that you can take the money to any provider of schooling, that the public provider doesn't own the money, and that we don't fret over their loss of money, they're responsible for attracting customers just like anybody else would be. So we, and then we provide scholarships through the Walton Family Funds of the world and or through public entities, the state or the federal government, so that qualifying low-income family children can attend schools that would work best for them and have somebody else pay the top-off amount if they're unable to. If we insist on free only, we're going to provide for a much smaller menu of schooling options. So the key question to ask here, if somebody gasps, as they will, when it dawns on them that this notion of high minimum subsidy and allowing families to top it off if they want to pay for more schooling than the publicly funded amount allows them to do, when they gasp and say, oh, that means some of the options won't be free, that people have to pay, that's so unfair to low-income families. The key point to make there is this last sentence here on this slide. How can free only produce more equitable access to options that will not exist with free only? Okay, so in other words, if we mandate free only, there are things that will not exist that would exist if we allow what will amount to, in many cases, temporarily having to top off your publicly funded amount with a third party or your money or your own money. So if we end the free only and we allow these top-up fees, then some additional options will exist that in time will at least become available to low-income families, or with these third-party funded scholarships will eventually become, otherwise they wouldn't exist. So I know the language of this is awkward, so let me read the phrase there again. I don't like reading PowerPoint slides, but let me read it again. How can free only produce more equitable access to options that will not exist with free only? How can it be unfair to make somebody pay for something that won't exist if it doesn't have to be paid for on top of the subsidy amount? Okay, so then finally the bottom line in terms of fair or unfair to low-income families is the current system is a disaster for low-income families. And so if we get away from that, it's hard to imagine that we could make things any worse. Again, I can't put that forward as a fact, although a lot of people believe that it is, but it's certainly an opinion that I hold that I think is well-grounded. Low expectations should exist also for price-controlled private production. There's a huge difference between alleged markets in which prices orchestrate and profits and losses orchestrate decisions on how much to produce, how to produce it, and in what sorts of specializations to undertake. There's a big difference between trying to do that privately when the government says how much it should cost and maybe even disallows profit. There's a big difference between that and allowing prices to orchestrate entry and exit and to orchestrate what will be produced and how in the way of schooling. You can see I've listed some things here. We get bad attitudes. If somebody has something to sell and there's more than enough customers available, that leaves room for them to have a bad attitude about it. And it leaves room for them to cut corners and to scheme about it, because if they make somebody mad, they're readily replaced from the wait list. And for the same reason, the only way to make more money in those cases, or just human nature to slack off when you can, is to do a less excellent job, to let the quality of the product erode. Again, if you have a wait list because of the price control and you cut corners and the quality starts to slide a little bit, as long as you still have a wait list, you're not going to suffer any loss on the revenue side. And the quality erosion may be deliberate to save money on the cost side, so it's a way to make more money. And this notion of quality erosion is one of the few things that economists do not disagree on. Price control that creates shortages reduces the quality of the product. That's very widely agreed to, although not widely known. The complexity of the product, the importance of good decision-making by parents, as well as educators, is one reason often alleged for the government to provide the product and to assign you to it. But for me, it's only a reason for the government to create and provide data, but not necessarily to produce the product. Make it possible for people to inform themselves, make it easier for them to find information, make it easy for them to visit schools and see for themselves, and maybe do some regulation, but not necessarily produce the schooling to address those issues. I mentioned Brown a few slides ago. I didn't realize until I looked at this slide a few minutes ago that I have it up here again. But this is a controversial point that we want to spend some time in class discussing. Do parents really value uniformity among schools enough to have to choose from a menu of uniform options? It certainly isn't true for most goods, but again, schooling is different, and maybe it is for this. We know from other consumer products, including education to some extent, that private information channels are also likely to be widespread for something that's purchased as frequently and for something that costs as much as schooling. So we can rely on, for example, the Good Housekeeping seal to suddenly be something like that, to be suddenly available to a greater extent than it already is. Reputations will be significant. In other words, parents will be lazy to some extent. They will just go by their reputation of a school, in many cases deciding, at least as a first cut on that basis, for considering it, and then they will look at exactly what they do and how they do it to see if it fits their children. Reputations are slowly acquired and easily tarnished. And this is another reason why schools may do better in complicated, as a complex good in a market, not worse. So again, those are reasons, to me, my opinion, that we can discuss and reject and refute, or maybe fortify through our discussion. Those are reasons to favor ending the traditional public school monopoly that stifles private schooling, makes it hard to sell something that's available for free. But intelligent people disagree on whether that's a reason to end that finance monopoly or whether it's a reason to sustain it. This has already come up in some of our discussions online, and I'm not sure, I can't remember if it came up in class, but by golly, if we're going to let schooling be subject to market forces, that means that profit and loss and bankruptcy is part of the picture. And indeed, it's a normal and critical element of market-centric production. And the person who brought this issue up said that this was not acceptable for schooling, for children to suddenly be thrust out into the open and have to search for a new school, perhaps in mid-year. Now, I agree, mid-year closure would be disruptive, and there are ways to avoid that. And a so-called closure does not necessarily mean that the school will be closed and that kids will suddenly have to go elsewhere. It may mean that somebody will take over the school, and perhaps we can provide for those kinds of takeovers, either directly through a takeover entity or indirectly through a performance bond. Certainly, it's something that parents would take into account in choosing a school. They might demand proof of financial ability to sustain the school for the whole year. But in any event, school operators could buy insurance to show parents who ask that kind of a question, or the government could insist that school operators provide such insurance. So my tentative assessment of all of these different arguments, and again, I'm putting it out there for discussion. Intelligent people do not agree. But yes, schooling is definitely different, but it's not enough different in ways that favor government production to rule out market accountability-based transformation strategies. And indeed, my opinion is that those issues may ultimately and probably already favor market-centric governance and perhaps funding. And indeed, market strengths probably outweigh market weaknesses for much more extensive use, though maybe not exclusive use, of market-centric governance and funding. Concluding remarks, let me see if this works. The evidence creates many potential trade-offs to resolve, and it also casts doubt, if not outright rejects, some talking points that are widely used. Well, it was an experiment. I clicked something there while I was talking, and it blotted out my slide, which I didn't anticipate. It was supposed to be Porky Pig saying, but that's all, folks. Well, I don't do it as well as Porky. This is the last slide of this thing, of this PowerPoint. But since I only used another 15 minutes in the second one, let me take a few more minutes of your time to hopefully have the effect of generating some discussion by reviewing some of the items that came up in the initial longer segment that I just recorded. First of all, and I looked it over, and I'm a rookie at this, and I stuttered, and I stammered a little bit, and I looked down too much, and now I'm sitting to see if that works any better. So there's a lot of experimentation that's going on here. So let me just look down at my list and make sure that I touch on a few points that perhaps I should have, but I was a little too nervous in talking to this empty room in front of a camera. On the issue of top-down accountability, it has been in a focus, increasing top-down accountability has been an intense focus since at least 1983 when the Nation at Risk report came out, and perhaps as early as the 1950s when Why Johnny Can't Read came out, and then the Sputnik flyover by the Russians scared us, and we decided that one of the problems that we needed to address was schooling. And so we haven't got much to show for it. In fact, maybe the issue is, how do we actually use it? Because while there's been a lot of attention to it and a lot of talk about standards and accountability and testing, there really hasn't been a whole lot of accountability. So maybe we better figure out something that, if we believe in top-down accountability, or we're unwilling to leverage increased bottom-up subjective accountability, we better figure out a way that politically that we can actually impose some significant factually oriented and not fraudulently test score oriented top-down accountability. And we probably ought to figure out some way to address the perverse effects of increased accountability, if we ever manage it, of increased top-down accountability. And by that I mean the narrowing of the curriculum, the increased emphasis on test-taking skills at the expense of other items on the curriculum, and the fraudulent activities that have been occurring to try to make the schools look better just by falsifying the scores or changing the answers that the kids give after they've turned their tests in. All right, now on the issue of bottom accountability, one of the issues that I didn't mention when I first went through the slides initially in the other Module 3 presentation is the issue of the ownership of the money. The traditional public schools act like they own the money, that money raised from all taxpayers, I would argue to finance all children, belongs to them, and that if any inconvenience or harm can be alleged as a result of people leaving traditional public schools, that ought not to be allowed, because implicitly we raise the money for these schools and not children. I would argue that that's false, but that indeed, to avoid the transitional effects which can be disruptive, that we should phase in non-discriminatory allocation of taxpayer funding for schools. And by that I mean that at first it just doesn't make sense because of payment of debt and because of transitional effects and the need for schools to adjust to the loss of children or to competitive pressures. It just doesn't make sense to finance them all at the total public funding divided by the number of students, which is what I mean by non-discriminatory funding. So maybe at first we provide 60% of the money that's spent per pupil in a traditional public school, and then gradually up to 70%, 80%, 90%, and 100%, to eventually assert what I think all of us believe, namely that children that attend traditional public schools are not more worthy of public financial support than children whose families believe that they would do better in a school not owned by the government, not run through the political process. And a sidebar to all of that is that the public schools may allege a loss and a negative effect on the children when they lose money, but as you know from previous discussion, there's not been very much evidence, if any, that the per pupil funding within the range in which it's varied in the last 30 years, which has been considerable, has mattered to the outcomes, at least the measured outcomes, of traditional public schools. For now, what has been the norm is very extensive discrimination against the users of non-public schools. For the most part, they have received, if they receive any public funding at all, it's just been a fraction of the state share of public funding, which is typically a half, maybe a little bit more than half. So, for example, a voucher or a tax credit or an education savings account may be funded at quite a bit less, a lot less than even half, in many cases, sometimes close to half, of the approximately $13,000 per child per year we spend as a national average on traditional public school students. So again, that discrimination implicitly asserts that traditional public schools own the money, and by failing to include the district money alongside the state money, we assert that at least the district money is owned by the traditional public schools, and that it shouldn't follow those who believe that the district provided schooling is not the best choice for their children. Now that said, the districts, and some have, for example, you might want to Google Douglas County schools in Colorado. That district believes in school choice and is trying to provide that for their children. And in addition to that, it's legally possible for the state to force the district money to be part of any funding for school choice. Last point that I want to discuss is the issue of large versus small schools. It's well known, perhaps it hasn't reached you yet, but it's well known within the school system reform studies debate that the schools are too big. That's widely agreed to. Yet, districts continue to build large schools. How can this be? Well, because small schools cannot be comprehensive. By definition, a small school is something that can provide relatively few offerings in large enough amounts, in amounts that will be chosen by enough students to make them financially viable. So yes, we should have smaller schools, but the only way to have smaller schools is for them to specialize in something. And as soon as you open up the notion that schools will have to specialize in something to be effective at what they're doing, then you have to have school choice. Okay? So the large school, small school issue is that small schools cannot be comprehensive, and the only way to deal with student diversity and educator diversity without school choice among specialized schooling options is to have large schools with lots and lots of electives in them. Now, as part of that discussion, the transportation issue is raised quite often. If we were to have more if we were to have school choice, which means it's easier financially to opt out of your traditional public school, we would have more schools. Okay, that would alleviate and in fact ease some of the transportation issues. They would have more schools. They'd be smaller, so we'd have to have more. We'd have more online schooling. Okay, so that eliminates any transportation issue for the children that opt for that. We'd have more blended learning, which means that we might have more or less school transportation needs, depending on exactly which children choose which mixture of online versus off-site. For example, if a child chooses some online schooling mixed with some of at their traditional public school, then that has probably no effect. They still need to get to their school, unless we can break it down by day of the week, and then maybe we have less transportation cost, because they may not need to get to their school 5 days a week, so we might not need as many buses and bus drivers. So we have more schools, and they'd be closer. However, since they'd be specialized, the school that's right for Johnny or Susie may be further from the family home than the traditional public school used to be. The answer, tentatively, to this difficult issue, from my perspective, is just to make it attractive enough for the schools to potentially compete on the spaces. And secondarily, this may be the boost for public transportation that a lot of cities need. That this may be the additional ridership that they need to provide increased service that would attract additional riders, school children, as well as other riders. All right, with that, I'm going to sign off, and that's it for the recordings of for the Module 3. And I will try one more time to see if we can get Porky Pig to come up here, but for some reason that did not work the first time. In any event, that's all for Module 3, and we'll try this again for Module 4 and 5 and so on, hoping that I get better at it as we go along.